What makes a man kill, not once, not twice, but again and again, without regret? Psychologists say serial killers fall into categories: some crave control, others seek revenge, and some kill simply because they want to. No remorse, no hesitation, no stopping. That is the mind of Bernard Giles. A 20-year-old husband and father, blending into society while carrying an unspeakable darkness. A man who didn't escalate into murder, he started there. And when he spoke about his crimes, it wasn't with guilt, but with chilling clarity. Tonight, we take you inside the mind of a true predator. This is the real story of Bernard Giles. In the fall of 1973, a series of young women vanished without a trace in Florida. The man behind these disappearances would later confess with a chilling calmness. To understand the story of Bernard Giles, we have to step back into the world of 1973, a time when the country was changing. The Vietnam War was nearing its end, counterculture movements were reshaping American society, and hitchhiking was a common way for young people to get around. But that freedom came at a cost. Titusville, Florida, a quiet town on the Space Coast, was no stranger to crime, but what was about to unfold would haunt the community forever. On the surface, Bernard Eugene Giles was nothing out of the ordinary. At just 20 years old, he was already a husband and a father. He worked as an electrician, providing for his family. But beneath that facade was something much darker. Unlike many serial killers, Giles didn't start with petty crimes. He didn't work his way up from theft, arson, or stalking. No, his very first crime was murder. And once he started, he showed no intention of stopping. Between September and November of 1973, at least 5 women disappeared in and around Titusville. They were young, full of life, and had no idea that stepping into Bernard Giles' car would be the last decision they ever made. Nancy Jerry, 18, September 26, 1973. Nancy Jerry was the first to go missing. An 18-year-old with her whole life ahead of her, she was last seen hitchhiking near U.S. Highway 1. She never made it to her destination. Sharon Weimer, 14, October 1973. Just weeks later, 14-year-old Sharon Weimer disappeared under eerily similar circumstances. A child, too young to understand the danger lurking behind the wheel of a stranger's car. Krista Melton, 17, October 1973. Then came 17-year-old Krista Melton. A teenager who trusted that the kindness of strangers was real. But that trust would cost her everything. Carolyn Bennett, 17, November 1973. Carolyn Bennett, another 17-year-old, vanished after accepting a ride. Like the others, her fate would remain unknown until Giles' chilling confession. Paula Hamrick, 20, November 1973. The final known victim was 20-year-old Paula Hamrick. She, too, disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a family that never saw her again. 5 women. 5 lives stolen. 5 families shattered. And the man responsible? He showed no remorse. It all began with Nancy Jerry. On September 26, 1973, she was walking alone when a car pulled up beside her. Bernard Giles offered her a ride. She accepted. She never came home. Her friends and family searched desperately, but in 1973, missing persons cases weren't treated with urgency, especially when it involved a young woman who might have just run away. The police had no leads. No witnesses. No evidence. But what they didn't know was that Nancy's disappearance was only the beginning. Over the next 2 months, more women would vanish. But the man responsible? He was just getting started. Stay with us as we uncover the terrifying rise of Bernard Giles, the man who killed without hesitation, and without guilt. The pattern was impossible to ignore. One by one, young women were disappearing from the streets of Titusville, each last seen hitchhiking alone. But no bodies had been found. No crime scenes, no evidence, just silence. By the time the second and third women had vanished, an uneasy fear settled over the city. Parents warned their daughters. Friends stopped hitchhiking. But for law enforcement, there was still no clear suspect, and no way to connect the cases. Between September and November 1973, 5 young women disappeared. They didn't run away. They weren't leaving their lives behind. They were taken. The first was 18-year-old Nancy Jerry. Then, just weeks later, 14-year-old Sharon Weimer. After that, 17-year-old Krista Melton, then Carolyn Bennett, and finally, Paula Hamrick. All 5 women had been hitchhiking. All 5 were young. And all 5 had one thing in common: they had unknowingly stepped into the car of Bernard Giles. We knew something was happening. Young women were disappearing at an alarming rate, but without bodies or crime scenes, we had nowhere to start. The Brevard County Sheriff's Office began investigating, but in the early 1970s, there were no security cameras, no databases linking missing persons cases, and forensic science was still in its infancy. These were not runaway cases, but without evidence, police had little to go on. Investigators interviewed the missing women's friends and families. Were they involved with dangerous people? Did they have enemies? Had they mentioned anything unusual? The answer was always the same: no. These were normal young women, gone without a trace. Authorities urge young women to avoid hitchhiking as the number of missing persons cases continues to rise. As the pressure mounted, investigators grasped at any possible leads. Witnesses reported seeing the missing women with different men. Tips poured in about suspicious individuals, but none led to answers. One suspect, a known drifter, was briefly detained. He had a history of violence, and police believed he might be the one responsible. But after hours of questioning, they had nothing. No evidence, no confessions, and no link to the missing women. Another tip led them to a well-known hitchhiker who frequented the same areas as the victims. But again, he was cleared. With every false lead, the real killer remained unnoticed, blending into society, hiding in plain sight. We were chasing shadows. Every lead felt like a breakthrough, but they all led nowhere. Meanwhile, whoever was responsible was still out there, still hunting. The city of Titusville was on edge. Parents no longer let their daughters walk alone. Hitchhiking, once a common way to travel, now carried an unspoken warning: you might not come back. But for Bernard Giles, that fear meant nothing. Because while investigators were scrambling for clues, he was already planning his next move. And soon, the truth would come out in the most unexpected way imaginable. For months, Bernard Giles had operated undetected. Hitchhiking young women, taking them to isolated areas, and leaving their bodies where no one would find them. But on December 10, 1973, something changed. For the first time, he picked the wrong victims. 2 teenage girls, young and naive, thought nothing of accepting a ride from the friendly man who pulled up beside them. But they would soon realize the horrifying mistake they had made. The car ride started normal enough. Giles made small talk, asking them where they were headed. But then, something shifted. His tone became darker. His smile faded. When he turned off the main road and drove them deep into an isolated area, the girls knew they were in danger. Giles pulled out a gun and ordered them out of the car. He had done this before, he had no doubt they would obey. But this time, something unexpected happened. Instead of freezing in fear, the girls fought back. In the chaos, they managed to escape. They ran for their lives, their screams echoing through the night, hoping, praying, someone would hear them. By sheer luck, they reached a house and frantically banged on the door. A homeowner let them in, and moments later, the police were called. The nightmare was over, but for Bernard Giles, his reign of terror was about to come to an end. The 2 girls provided police with a detailed description of their attacker. A white male, early 20s, medium build, brown hair. He had a gun. He drove a light-colored car. It wasn't long before officers made a match: Bernard Eugene Giles. A local electrician, a husband, a father. Someone no one had suspected. The next day, December 11, 1973, police arrived at his home. Giles answered the door, calm, almost too calm. But when officers told him why they were there, that facade began to crack. Unlike many serial killers, Bernard Giles didn't try to deny what he had done. He didn't bargain, he didn't plead. He confessed. And what he told police was horrifying beyond belief. He was cold. Detached. He walked us through it like he was giving directions to a grocery store. Giles admitted to picking up young women, taking them to remote locations, and executing them with little hesitation. No struggle, no second thoughts. Just a cold, calculated plan. One by one, he led police to the places where he had discarded their bodies. The remains of Nancy Jerry, Sharon Weimer, Krista Melton, Carolyn Bennett, and Paula Hamrick were finally found. Their families now had answers, but no peace. Bernard Giles, the man who seemed like any other hard-working husband and father, had been living a double life. A man with an uncontrollable urge to kill. And when asked why he did it, his answer was chilling. I knew I was going to kill them the moment I picked them up. But what led him down this path? Was he born a killer? Or did something turn him into one? In the next chapter, we'll dive into the mind of Bernard Giles, and the disturbing psychology behind his crimes. With a full confession, the case against Bernard Giles was airtight. But the real question was, what would the justice system do with a man who had admitted, without remorse, to taking 5 innocent lives? The trial that followed would not be a drawn-out legal battle. There were no protests of innocence, no attempts at justification. Bernard Giles knew he was guilty, and he made no attempt to fight it. In 1974, Bernard Giles pled guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder. There would be no trial, no jury deliberations. Just a sentencing. Given the severity of his crimes, the death penalty was considered, but in the end, Giles received 5 consecutive life sentences. For the families, it was a small victory. Their daughters, sisters, and friends were never coming home. But at least the man responsible would never walk free again. But Bernard Giles was not finished making headlines. 5 years into his sentence, in 1979, he did the unthinkable. Somehow, despite being a convicted serial killer under maximum security, Giles managed to escape from prison. For 26 hours, the people of Florida lived in terror, knowing that a predator was loose. Law enforcement launched a massive manhunt. Officers scoured the area, warning civilians not to approach him. Helicopters flew overhead, and roadblocks were set up across the state. For over a day, he remained at large. But Giles was not as cunning as he believed. He was quickly spotted, captured, and dragged back to prison, this time, with even tighter security. His escape was brief, but the psychological impact on the community was lasting. For a moment, the horror of 1973 felt fresh again. And for the families of his victims, the wound was reopened. For the small town of Titusville, Florida, Bernard Giles became a name synonymous with fear. Parents warned their daughters never to hitchhike. Women felt unsafe on the roads. The days of trusting strangers had ended. For the victims' families, closure was a word that never truly applied. Their daughters were gone, stolen in an act of senseless brutality. No amount of justice could bring them back. He destroyed so many lives, and he didn't even care. He took my sister, my best friend. And he just confessed like it was nothing. Unlike many serial killers, Bernard Giles did not suffer a traumatic childhood. He was not abused, nor was he raised in a violent household. By all accounts, he was an ordinary boy who grew into an ordinary man. So, what makes someone like him kill? In later interviews, Giles admitted that he had an uncontrollable compulsion to murder. He described his crimes as something he had to do. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts, only an urge that he couldn't resist. Experts would later categorize him as a power and control killer, someone who took pleasure in the act of domination and execution. Giles had no emotional connection to his victims. They were objects to him, nothing more than something to use and discard. Bernard Giles remains in prison to this day, serving out his 5 life sentences. Unlike many serial killers, he never sought the spotlight. He gave interviews, but only when asked. He never glorified his crimes, because, to him, they were simply inevitable. As time passes, the horrors of 1973 fade into history. But for those who lost their daughters, sisters, and friends, the pain never fades. This case serves as a reminder. Evil does not always come with warning signs. Sometimes, it looks like an ordinary man, living an ordinary life, until the mask slips. But Bernard Giles was not the only serial killer who preyed on hitchhikers. Across America, young women continued to disappear. Some were found. Others never were. In our next case, we explore another dark mind, one even more elusive than Giles himself. What do you think? Was Bernard Giles an anomaly, or are there more like him, walking among us? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because the truth is always darker than fiction.